17 graves sit behind a crossbeam that the county has tried to tear down 4 separate times, and 4 separate times the men sent to do it have walked off the job before sundown. 11 of those graves have names on them that match the official state execution ledger, dates and crimes lined up clean, a hanging on paper for every stone in the ground. The other 6 have no match anywhere. No trial record, no newspaper notice, no coroner's report. Just a name, a date, and dirt that county surveyors have measured 3 times because they keep getting a different number of plots each time they count. This is the story of the Marrow family of Perished Fork, West Virginia, the clan that Tolliver County paid for 4 generations to be its hangman, its gravedigger, and its keeper of a wooden structure that the family itself refers to, in letters going back to 1841, only as the beam. Locals call them the Gallows Clan, and they have called them that since before the Civil War, first as an insult, then as a warning, and now, if you ask the handful of people who still live along that stretch of the fork, as something closer to a description of a debt that has never once come fully paid. The Marrows did not build the gallows because the county asked them to. They built it because Obadiah Marrow made an arrangement in the winter of 1839 that ended a sickness killing the fork 1 household at a time, and the terms of that arrangement, as far as anyone has ever been able to piece together from the family's own papers, required that the beam never stand bare for more than 7 years running. Not idle, not empty. Something has to hang from it, lawfully or otherwise, before the 7th year closes, or the fork pays the difference itself. And on at least 3 occasions that anyone has documented, the fork paid. We are going to walk through all of it today. The compact Obadiah struck and the sickness it supposedly ended. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching this from tonight, and if your part of the country has its own version of a family like this one, a family everybody quietly agrees to leave alone, put it in the comments. I want to see how far this kind of story actually travels. Perished Fork is not on most maps. It's a tributary that peels off the Elk River drainage in what's now the northern edge of Tolliver County, a name the state assigned in 1852 when it carved the county out of older territory, and the fork kept the name it already had, which locals will tell you predates the county itself by a good 60 years. Nobody agrees on how it got that name. The polite version, the one printed in the 1976 County Centennial booklet, says an early surveying party lost a man to fever along its banks, and the name stuck as a memorial. The version you hear if you buy someone a drink in the right gas station parking lot is that the fork got its name because something along its banks has always been in the business of finishing people off, long before any Marrow ever set foot there. What isn't in dispute, because it's sitting in the Tolliver County Courthouse in a deed book anyone can request, is that in October of 1839 a man named Obadiah Marrow purchased 40 acres along the Upper Fork from a landholder who was, according to the same deed, selling because his entire household had died that summer of what the record calls a wasting fever. That fever had been moving through the Fork's dozen or so homesteads since the spring. Contemporary letters, some of them preserved in a regional historical society collection 2 counties over, describe entire families going down with it inside of a week, cattle dying in the same pastures, wells that suddenly ran the colour of rust. By the time Obadiah bought his 40 acres, the Fork had lost close to 1/3 of its population, and the families still standing had started leaving. Obadiah did not leave. And according to a letter his wife Selah wrote to her sister in 1841, 2 years later, when the fever had stopped and the Fork had begun, slowly, to fill back in with new settlers who didn't know any better, Obadiah told anyone who asked that he had made a bargain to end it. He never wrote down, in anything that survives, exactly who or what he made that bargain with. He wrote down the terms. Seller's letter quotes him almost word for word, and the phrasing is strange enough that historians who've looked at it tend to agree it wasn't something Obadiah invented for effect. He wasn't a literary man. The letter says the fork would be spared so long as the beam was fed, that the feeding could be lawful, meaning an actual hanging carried out under whatever passed for county authority at the time, but that lawful or not, something had to hang from it before 7 years closed on the last one, or the fork itself would settle the account. Tolliver County did not have a permanent gallows before this. Executions, rare as they were in a sparsely settled back country, had been carried out on whatever timber was handy, usually taken down again within the week. What Obadiah built on his 40 acres in the winter of 1839 was different. It was permanent, oak-framed, set into the hillside on a stone footing that a University of West Virginia archaeology survey dated, using mortar analysis, to that same period, and it has stood in that spot, repaired and reinforced but never rebuilt from scratch, for 185. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Annual stipend and, more usefully to Obadiah, a guarantee that nobody would ask too many questions about what happened on his 40 acres between 1841 and 1913, when West Virginia moved all executions to the state penitentiary and effectively ended the county's use of the beam. The state's own archived records show 11 lawful hangings carried out at what the paperwork calls the Marrow Gallows, or, in later documents, simply the fork site. 11 men, 11 crimes ranging from murder to horse theft, which carried a capital sentence in the earliest years. 11 dates that line up with 11 headstones in the small fence plot the family kept behind the structure. That part of the story, grim as it is not the part that should bother you. What should bother you is that the plot behind the gallows has 17 stones in it, and it has had 17 stones in it since at least 1897, according to a survey commissioned that year by a Tolliver County clerk named Winifred Task, who was trying to settle a boundary dispute between the Marrow land and a neighbouring farm, and needed an accurate count of everything sitting on the disputed acreage. Her surveyor's notes, which survive in the courthouse archive because nobody has ever thought to throw them out, list 17 marked graves, 11 of which he could match to the county's own execution record, and 6 of which had names and dates that corresponded to no trial, no newspaper account, and no death certificate anywhere in the county's files. Winifred Task did what a good clerk does. She flagged the discrepancy in her official report and recommended the sheriff's office investigate. The sheriff's office, according to a follow-up letter in the same file, declined on the grounds that the graves were on private land and the family had every right to bury whoever they pleased there. Winifred wrote back twice, pointing out that 2 of the 6 unmatched names belonged to men she personally remembered as living residents of the Fork as recently as the 1880s, men who had, as far as she or anyone else in the county could recall, simply stopped being mentioned one year and were never brought up again. Her third letter on the subject is the last document in the file. There is no response to it. Before we move on to what happened in 1911, stop for a second. What you just heard about the 17 graves and the 6 unmatched names is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the full account, the actual courthouse documents, side by side, the 17 grave survey, the 6 unmatched names. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. 14 years after Winifred Task's report went unanswered, in the spring of 1911, the Fork was without a lawful hanging for the 6th year running, and the 7-year clock Selah Marrow had described in her letter 70 years earlier was, according to the family's own private ledger, closing fast. That ledger, which a Marrow descendant eventually donated to a regional archive in 2004 along with a box of other family papers, is the single most important document in this entire story, because it's the only place where the family wrote down, plainly and without much apparent guilt, what they did when the county didn't hand them a lawful execution in time. The ledger shows that in years when no hanging occurred, the family would sometimes hang an effigy from the beam instead, a straw figure dressed in old clothes, left to hang for a full turn of the moon before being taken down and burned. This happened at least 9 times between 1000, 841 and 1911. And the ledger treats it as routine maintenance, the same tone you'd use for oiling a hinge or patching a roof. But the ledger also shows that this substitute didn't always hold. There's a notation in Reuben Marrow's handwriting, Obadiah's son and the second keeper of the beam, dated August of 1866, that reads, "In full, the straw did not satisfy this time, and Amos went to the fork on the 9th and has not been found. Amos Marrow was Reuben's own younger brother. By 1911 the current keeper was Reuben's son Ezra, and the ledger entry from that April is shorter and colder than either of the ones before it. It reads only, 7 years unfed, took the Hollis boy instead of one of ours, will not happen again." The Hollis family had lived on the fork for 2 generations by 1911, tenant farmers on land adjacent to the Marrow property, and county school enrollment records show a Hollis boy named Dessel, age 11, listed as a student in the fall term of 1910 and absent from every roll call afterward. There is no death certificate for Dessel Hollis. There is no record of his family relocating. The 1920 census, taken 9 years later, still lists his parents at the same address on the fork, with no mention of a son. This is the part of the story where you'd expect a newspaper investigation, an arrest, something. There wasn't one. The fork was remote enough, and the county sheriff's office small enough, that a missing tenant farmer's child in 1911 barely registered outside the immediate community, and what little local reporting exists from the period simply notes that the Hollis family, quote, moved on shortly after, unquote, the same phrase used almost verbatim to describe at least 4 other disappearances tied to the fork over the following century. It is, without exaggeration, the single most repeated wrong word in this entire archive, moved on. It shows up in census annotations, in sheriff's incident logs, in church membership rolls where a family is simply struck from the list with that phrase written beside it. Nobody moved on. Nobody has ever been able to find a single family that used that phrase to describe leaving the fork and then turned up anywhere else in the historical record, not in a neighbouring county, not on a ship manifest, not on a single subsequent census in the entire United States. The 17th grave, the last of the 6 unmatched, is Dessel Hollis. His stone, which still stands in that plot today, gives only his name and the year 1911, no epitaph, no scripture, nothing else. A local historian named Orpha Task, who is Winifred Task's great-granddaughter and who still lives on the fork and has, by her own account, spent the better part of 40 years quietly documenting everything the county itself never followed up on, is the person who first matched that stone to the missing schoolboy, cross-referencing the enrollment record against the family ledger in the early 1980s. She still tends that small plot today, an act she describes not as sentiment but as a kind of ongoing agreement she never chose to be part of and has decided not to break. She'll walk you as far as the fence line if you ask her nicely. She will not go past it after dark, and she'll tell you plainly that this isn't superstition, it's simply that she has seen what happens to people who do. There is one more entry in Ezra Marrow's hand worth reading in full before we move past 1911, because it's the closest thing the family ledger ever gets to an explanation rather than a record. Written the following winter, it reads, "My father told me the beam does not care whose blood feeds it, only that it is fed, and that the choosing is not ours to make once the 7th year has closed. We are not permitted to offer. We are only permitted to keep count." Ezra kept that count faithfully for the rest of his life, and the ledger shows an effigy raised in 1913, 1917, and again in 1923, each one noted with the same clipped phrasing his father and grandfather had used, straw satisfied, nothing more. The ledger goes quiet after 1931, not because the family stopped keeping it, but because Ezra's son, Talbot Marrow, who inherited the role that year, was by most accounts a harder, more private man than his father, and the entries from his tenure are sparse to the point of uselessness, sometimes nothing more than a single word and a date. What isn't sparse is the county's own paper trail from the same period, because 1934 is the year Tolliver County's newly appointed public health officer, a physician named Corwin Delasey, who had transferred in from Charleston and had no prior connection to the Fork or its reputation, filed a formal complaint with the state medical board about a stillbirth registered at the Marrow homestead that he was never permitted to examine. His complaint, still on file, states that the family refused entry to the property for 11 days following the reported death, that no burial permit was ever requested despite state law requiring one, and that when he finally did gain access, escorted by the sheriff, he found no infant, no grave, and no explanation beyond Talbot Marrow's flat insistence that the matter had already been, in his words, settled. DeLacy's complaint also notes, almost as an aside, that the sheriff who escorted him seemed reluctant to press the matter further once they were actually standing on the property, a detail DeLacy found strange enough to write down, but not strange enough, apparently, to push on himself either. The state board took no action. DeLacy left the county 18 months later and, according to a brief mention in a Charleston newspaper archive, spent the rest of his career refusing to discuss his time in Tolliver County with colleagues who asked, "That single-filed complaint is the closest anyone in an official capacity ever came to directly confronting what the Ledger had been quietly describing for a century, and it went nowhere. The same way Winifred Task's report went nowhere in 1897, the same way every other flagged irregularity connected to this family has gone nowhere. The pattern isn't cover-up in the dramatic sense. Nobody in this story destroyed evidence or paid anyone off. The pattern is simpler and, honestly, more unsettling than a conspiracy would be. It's 180 years of ordinary people choosing the explanation that let them stop looking." The next real documented incident is 1959, and it's the one that finally put the Marrow Gallows on the state's radar as something other than a historical curiosity. West Virginia's Highway Department was routing a new stretch of state road through the Upper Fork that year, a project that required relocating several structures on the proposed right-of-way, including, according to the contractor's crew, led by a road engineer named Garrett Oxley, began dismantling the structure on a Tuesday morning in June. By that Thursday, Oxley had filed a report with his supervisor requesting the job be reassigned, citing, in his own words preserved in the DOT project file, equipment that will not hold a charge on that hillside and men who will not go back up there for any wage I am authorized to offer. The specifics never made it into any official summary, but 3 separate crew members gave near identical accounts decades later when a graduate student researching the road's history tracked them down for oral interviews in the 1990s. All 3 described the same thing happening independently on different days that week. A generator would cut out the instant a hand touched the main crossbeam. A truck parked at the base of the hill would fail to start, batteries fully charged, no mechanical fault ever found. And on the Thursday that finally ended the job, according to the crew's own foreman, a man simply wasn't there anymore during the 10 minutes between the crew breaking for water and coming back to the site. His tools were where he'd left them. His truck was still parked at the bottom of the access road with the keys in it. Nobody has ever located him. His name does not appear in the official DOT incident report, which lists the job as abandoned due to logistical difficulties and reroutes the entire highway project around the Marrow property instead, a rerouting that survives today as a strange kink in the modern road that any local can point out to you, a curve that has no engineering justification except that the straight path used to run directly through a hillside nobody would finish clearing. If you want the county road engineer's original incident notes side by side with the graduate student's 1990s interview transcripts, that's also in the same linked document from earlier. Worth the 5 seconds if you haven't grabbed it yet. One detail from the 1990s oral history project rarely makes it into the shorter tellings of this story, and it's worth including here. The graduate student who tracked down Garrett Oxley's surviving crew members, a woman named Petra Coyne conducting fieldwork for a folklore studies program, asked each man independently, decades apart from one another and with no contact between them in the interim, to describe what the missing crewman had said in the 10 minutes before he vanished. Two of the three gave nearly identical answers. Both remembered him mentioning that he'd heard someone at the tree line say his own first name, clearly, the way a person you know well says it, and both remembered him laughing it off before he walked up to check, because there was nobody else scheduled to be on site that week, and the nearest Fork resident lived the better part of a mile off. Coyne's dissertation notes that she found the consistency between two unconnected accounts, given 40 years after the fact, more disturbing than either account taken alone. Independent memories don't usually agree on a detail that specific by coincidence. For the next 60 years, the Marrow Gallows sat mostly forgotten by anyone outside the immediate Fork community, tended in an unofficial capacity first by Ezra Marrow's descendants, and, after the direct line thinned out in the 1970s, by a distant cousin named Hollis Marrow, a name that raises an obvious question locally, since the family and the boy taken in 1911 share the surname, and whether that's coincidence or something closer to the Fork, keeping its own kind of ledger, is not a question anyone has been able to answer. Hollis Marrow is, as of this recording, in his early 80s and the last living person who still holds what remains of the family's informal role as keeper, though there has been no lawful hanging to feed, obviously, since executions moved to the state penitentiary system in 1913, and the family switched over entirely to the effigy tradition described in the old ledger, a straw figure replaced faithfully every few years, a practice Hollis maintains to this day with what Author Task describes as grim, unquestioning diligence. He has told the few reporters who've ever bothered to ask him about it that he does not believe in any of it, that he keeps the tradition purely out of respect for his family's history, and in the same breath he has never once let 7 years pass without a fresh effigy on that beam. Which brings us to 2022, and the reason this story finally made its way to a wider audience instead of staying a piece of county folklore. A private developer named Denton Ray purchased the adjoining 60 acres that year with plans to build a small subdivision along the improved stretch of State Road, and his surveyors, doing routine due diligence, discovered that the old gallows structure and its associated burial plot sat directly across the access route he needed for the development's main road. The Marrow family no longer legally owned that specific parcel, having sold off pieces of the original 40 acres over the decades, and Ray's attorneys determined that the structure itself, unlike a formally designated historical site, could legally be removed with the appropriate permits. Hollis Marrow objected, publicly and repeatedly, at 3 separate county commission meetings, each time repeating some version of the same warning that the beam could not stand empty, that it had never in 180 years gone more than 7 years without something hanging from it, lawful or otherwise, and that the last effigy had gone up in 2019, which put the county on a clock whether anyone on the commission wanted to believe that or not. The commission, understandably, treated this as exactly the kind of colourful local objection that gets a polite hearing and no actual weight in a permitting decision. The permits were approved in March of 2022. Demolition was scheduled for that September. Denton Ray, for what it's worth, was not a superstitious man by his own account, and he told a regional business journal covering the project stall that he had reviewed Hollis Marrow's objections with his legal team and considered them, quote, a matter for the county commission, not a construction hazard. He has since, in a follow-up interview given after the demolition was shelved, declined to say whether he still believes that. His exact words, when a reporter pressed him on it in 2023, were that he'd rather build somewhere else than find out he was wrong twice. The demolition crew, contracted out of a firm 2 counties away with no prior connection to the Fork or its history, arrived on a Monday. By Wednesday, according to incident reports, the contracting firm was later required to file with its insurer. 2 separate pieces of heavy equipment had suffered what the reports describe only as unexplained total electrical failure, both machines checked and cleared by technicians who found no fault, both machines simply refusing to restart anywhere near the structure and running perfectly the moment they were towed back down the access road. On Thursday, a subcontractor named Marlin Dietz, 34 years old, operating a small excavator near the base of the hill, radioed his foreman to say he'd spotted something at the tree line and was going to check it before continuing work. He did not radio back. His excavator was found idling, undamaged, exactly where he'd left it. Marlin Dietz has not been found, not by the search parties the county sheriff's office ran for 11 days that September, not by the cadaver dogs brought in from 2 neighbouring counties, not by anyone, in the 3 years since. Marlin Dietz's family has said little publicly, but his sister gave one brief statement to a local news station that fall, and it's stuck with almost everyone who's followed this case closely since. She said her brother had texted her a photo of the hillside that Wednesday morning, nothing unusual in it, just trees and a work site, and that he'd captioned it something like, "This job's giving me the creeps. Back tonight, though." She still has that text. It's the last thing he ever sent her. The Tolliver County Sheriff's Incident Report on Marlin Dietz's disappearance is, in its own way, the most modern version yet of the same wrong word this story keeps circling back to. It classifies him as a voluntary missing person, a category that requires no ongoing investigation once an initial search window closes on the stated grounds that his personal belongings, financial accounts, and vehicle showed no indication of foul play. It does not mention that his excavator was found running. It does not mention the 2 prior equipment failures that week. Deputy files obtained through a public records request do include an internal email. However, from the deputy who led the initial search to his supervisor, in which he writes that he does not personally believe Dietz walked away from that hillside under his own power, and that he would like it noted in his own file that he said so at the time. That email exists because one person, once again, refused to let the easy word stand without at least writing down that he knew better. I want to pause on that comment section again for a second, because I'm genuinely curious how many of you have your own version of ground that heavy equipment simply refuses to work on, not folklore about it. An actual documented, insurance-reported mechanical failure with no cause anyone could find. Put it below if you've got one, and hit subscribe if you want to see where I go looking next, because this fork is not the only place in this country with a paper trail like this one. The demolition project was quietly shelved after that. Denton Ray's development still exists on paper, but the access road runs around the Marrow parcel now, a second strange kink in a road that already had one, and the gallows still stands where Obadiah Marrow built it 186 years ago, its beam currently holding, as of Hollis Marrow's last confirmed maintenance visit, an effigy hung in the spring of 2024, which means the fork's next reckoning, if the pattern the family's own ledger describes is to be believed, comes due sometime before 2031. What makes this story different from the dozen other cursed family legends scattered through Appalachian folklore is how much of it exists in plain, boring, bureaucratic paper. This isn't campfire testimony passed down with no names attached. It's a deed book. A surveyor's notes a clerk filed because her job required accuracy and she wouldn't compromise on it, even when her superiors told her to drop it. A DOT incident report that quietly rerouted an entire state highway rather than explain, in any official capacity, why. An insurer's file on equipment failures a contracting firm had to report because that's what the law requires when a subcontractor goes missing on the job. Every single layer of this, the fever in 1839, the 6 unmatched graves, the vanished schoolboy, the road crew, the developer's demolition crew, exists because someone with an ordinary bureaucratic obligation to write things down did exactly that, and the paper trail simply never lines up with the explanations that were supposed to close each file. There's a version of this story that ends with a dramatic reveal, a hidden mass grave, a family arrested, a case finally closed a century late. That's not what the paper trail actually supports, and it's worth being honest about that instead of reaching for it. Nobody has ever found direct evidence that a living Marrow personally harmed Dessel Hollis, or the road engineer's vanished crewman, or Marlin Dietz. What the record shows, consistently, across 186 years, and at least 4 separate custodians of that ledger, is a family that appears to genuinely believe it is not the one doing the choosing, only the one keeping score, and a county, generation after generation, that has always found it easier to accept whatever word closed the file fastest than to ask a second question it might not like the answer to. Orpha Task, who has spent more hours in that courthouse archive than possibly anyone alive, put it to me plainly. She said the county has never once had to lie about the fork. Nobody forged a document. Nobody destroyed a file. All anyone ever had to do was pick the word that let them stop asking questions, moved on, logistical difficulties, unexplained failure, and let the next person inherit the silence instead of the answer. 6 generations of Tolliver County officials did exactly that, one small omission at a time, and the sum of all those small omissions is a family plot with 17 graves for 11 lawful deaths, a highway with 2 unexplained curves in it, and a beam that, as far as anyone has been willing to test, has never once been allowed to stand truly empty in 186 years. Ask Orpha Task why she keeps walking that fence line every spring. Why a woman with no legal obligation and no blood connection to the Marrow name has spent 40 years making sure a straw effigy gets renewed on schedule, and she won't give you a ghost story. She'll tell you about a great-grandmother who wrote 3 unanswered letters and a schoolboy named Dessel Hollis whose grave nobody would have ever properly identified if somebody, at some point, hadn't decided that keeping the count mattered more than being comfortable. She checks the beam, she says, because somebody in her family already tried looking away once, and it didn't change a single thing except who got to stop asking. She'd rather be the one who knows. As she put it the last time we spoke, someone in this county has kept an honest count since 1897. Somebody ought to keep doing it. If you want to see the fork for yourself, it's on public road now. Right up to the fence line, Orpha Task still walks every spring to check that beam. Nobody's stopping you from driving out there. Just don't go past the fence after dark, and if you do go, and something calls out from the tree line asking you to check on it, you might want to remember what happened to Marlin Dietz, and to a road engineer's missing crewman in 1959, and to a schoolboy named Dessel Hollis in the spring of 1911, every one of whom did exactly that. Tell me in the comments what you'd do if you inherited a piece of land with a debt like this one already attached to it. Would you keep the tradition going the way Hollis Marrow has, quietly, without ever quite admitting you believe in it, or would you be the one who finally lets the 7 years run out? I want to read every answer, and if you're local to that part of West Virginia and know something about the fork that never made it into any archive I've found, I'd genuinely like to hear it, because Orpha Task herself has said more than once that the courthouse only has what people bothered to write down, and plenty of people along that fork never did.